don't know how much Cara and the people joining for this session over Zoom have been attentive to what has been an incredibly rich 2 days. This is the final session. We had a fantastic session just before this with youth. I think for many in the room, it was the highlight of the 2 days. And in addition to that, we've had some rich discussions over some really complex issues, and we've covered a lot of terrain as well. So what I thought the final session would do or could do is, with the help of colleagues, both here in the room and Cara, you, to have a forward-looking perspective, of course, looking at what ails us today, but also to look at what is going to come at us and what can be done. So frontier issues that are going to be front door issues very quickly. And I'll tell you how quickly these things change. Just over lunch, as I've shared with a few of you, at least lunch here in New Zealand, might be a different time for the people on Zoom. Facebook has released a significant document and policy guidance for the company, embracing in a manner that it has never in its corporate history has human rights as a core business operating principle. I haven't read the document, but I am privileged to know the individual who heads human rights at Facebook, Miranda, who's a wonderful individual. I've known her for over 15 years. And it is that trust I place in her, even with all of the failings of the company, that one can look forward to with some optimism that this document will be enacted in full, and it's not just something that is printed or published for cosmetic purposes. And as I understand it, Alex Borovka, you might be listening in. Thank you for working with Miranda on this. So just to give a sense in the room that these things change very, very quickly in the course of the conference as well. Did you guys talk about an order of preference? We will, Cara, go as we've always done for the past 2 days. I will not introduce any one of you. Safe to say that as it has always been, it is also a privilege to have the both of you here. Kim, I was privileged to kind of be on a shared platform last year with the University of Canterbury on groupthink. Nicole, thank you for coming down to Dunners. And Cara, thank you for joining us from Aussie. So do you want to go first, or is maybe leave Cara last and one of you go first, if you don't mind, Cara. Okay. Take a mic, and I think Tom, we can get Nicole's presentation on screen. Yes, we have a clicker too, actually. Where is the clicker? Oh, the clicker is there. That's right. There you go.
So I thought I would just start by going through a few little things around misinformation. I've heard a lot about misinformation and disinformation today. I haven't heard about malinformation today or yesterday, so I thought I'd touch on that.
Yep.
And then work through what the kind of regulatory landscape that I work in is, and then look forward to what we could possibly start to do. And I'll just give one example because there's so many and I've got so little time, about what New Zealand could possibly do to help inoculate future infodemics from occurring. So in a regulatory environment, sorry, 2 different things to go. In a regulatory environment, really important to be able to understand the nuances of different types of misinformation. So I just wanted to make clear that misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, and the spectrum of which those different elements form together, and how we may go about assessing what kind of information we're dealing with when it comes to conspiracy theories, extremism, and things like that. So it's a very, very nuanced environment. And these are the kind of details that we kind of look for to try and understand them, how we might try to build frameworks towards dealing with them, and really trying to make not just government, but everybody else understand how that environment really converges together when it comes to social and online particularly, but also we see these off-world impacts as well at protests and things like that.
Should I move that forward for you?
Yeah,
awesome. Yeah.
Not enough hands. So one of the big points around the different types of misinformation is just how participatory, really tongue twister there, that is for communications and for communities. So we observe what's happening in those spaces. We have that emotional response, which I heard Maria talking about yesterday, and I've heard a couple of speakers also touch on that today. We share that, and that's certainly something we just heard from the youth that came to speak to us. And often we also search for like information. And this sort of goes around in this nice little echo chamber circle, and it becomes quite a vicious little echo chamber for everybody online, and it can have those offline impacts as well. So why do we participate, I think, is a really important question from a communications perspective as well. So we're consuming the information, but we're also communicating it outward as well once we've consumed it. So online in particular, content's delivered in a way that users consume it really, really quickly. We've all got really short attention spans, and we don't allow ourselves enough time to mentally process the information that's coming in. So our brains sort of have a little shortcut happening in there, so that when content is delivered in those little nudges, whether it's to buy something, to vote on something, to find out more about a piece of information, our brains sort of kick into gear and find those shortcuts, hook into the emotions, and that starts to shape our perceptions. And of course, the algorithms are working in the background to also serve us more of the content that we like and engage with. Very few internet users also know how those algorithms work. Really, really pleasing to find an audience yesterday and today. Everyone's really onto it. But when we talk to people about algorithms, they're kind of not really sure about what they do and how they work. Advertising is probably the best and clearest example that we can use to convey that information. So they don't understand why they keep seeing the information that they already like and share. And once they're in that echo chamber, it becomes really difficult for some of them to get out. They don't know how to break free, how to retrain the algorithm, how to get out and make a new little echo chamber for themselves that may be a bit more healthier, a bit more safe. So New Zealand has been an absolute model of great pandemic management, but we can't become complacent in the information space. Already we've seen scams and voting kind of frauds, offering people, you know, give us $49 and we'll give you a vaccine and all those kind of things popping up in New Zealand. We've seen social media content promoting the idea that the vaccine is a population control method, particularly in minority communities. We've already talked about this a few times, I think, certainly on our table, that the vaccine contains nanoparticles. Bill Gates is in there microchipping everybody, and they have DNA altering factors, and that's really converging with 5G, which 5G is now activating those little nanoparticles, and that's how we're all going to turn into robots. So a real convergence of different conspiracy theories, a real convergence of different types of misinformation. And it's important, sort of, if you kind of think back to those three different types of misinformation, it's not just everyday people believing different things that generate this stuff. It can also be nation states. Certainly in Europe, they're seeing a lot of sort of like soft power push in, if I could put it that way, into some of the Nordic countries in particular around vaccine, the different types of vaccines on offer in those countries and how the Russian vaccine is better, for example. So it's not just a grassroots movement thing. It's not just a conspiracy theorist thing. It can be at a quite high level as well. I think it's really important to remember that. So what do we have currently in our toolkit in New Zealand? We recognise well and surely that online harms and crimes are global, and our response needs to be global as well. But we need to protect everybody within our borders and beyond. We have the Unsolicited Electronic Messages Act and the Harmful Digital Messaging Act, as well as the Office and Film Classification Literature, which we work closely with in DIA in sorting out some of the the content that appears. We're also sending to the Budapest Convention, which is really, really important on an international scale. So that's going to generate a lot more discussion within New Zealand and how we go about delivering some of those more practical aspects of the convention. And then we're kind of looking future focused as well. So we want to think about the challenges that we see today, the challenges we're going to see coming. And that includes a wider media review by DI policy that I was encouraged to mention. So what can we do to learn, and where can we go for a bit of a hat tip around how do we manage this kind of stuff? Where around the world is doing this really well? Russia, and in my work with NATO, you know, they're also very, very concerned about Russia. We don't have those kind of geopolitical challenges, I guess, down here. But certainly when we think of Europe, they've been dealing with this infodemic, from vaccines to politics to pretty much any kind of topic or context you can think of, for generations. So the different countries have built different ways to deal with that. Finland's a really, really good example. You might think, what's Finland and New Zealand got in common? Quite a few things, actually. Both teams of 5+ million-ish, both led by very capable prime ministers. Sort of a very comparable land size as well. Small independent democracies. And we have a lot of shared similar views and values, which is really important. Finland starts their training for children in the education system around how to spot disinformation, malinformation, misinformation at the age of 6. So that's quite profound in terms of the level of discussions they're having in an age-appropriate way. So they evaluate, they fact check, they're taught to find sources in a really academic kind of educational approach. They learn in art how to look at digital images, how to Photoshop, what a Photoshop image looks like, what an AI-generated image may look like. And in science, they talk about vaccine disinformation, and they put some of the conspiracy theories to the test. So that's just a few of the things that I wanted to touch on, and what we can draw out of that Finland example. And it's just one example because there are so many that we could draw from. So the big keys for New Zealand would be, we can't regulate or legislate our way out of an infodemic. Online media can be the fuel to the social media fire, and we really need to continue to work with big tech on a safety by design approach. Building sovereign resilience is really, really important, and we need to do that before we need it. We can't wait until after it's become a massive problem. I come from Australia. Murdoch media, there's a lot of conspiracy theories happening, gets a lot of amplification, for example. So trying to build that now in that kind of context becomes really, really problematic. So building it before you need it is really, really important. And that is where I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Kim?
Kia ora koutou. I'm Kim Connolly-Stone, and I'm the Policy Director for Internet New Zealand. And for those of you who don't know about Internet New Zealand, we're a little NGO, and we run the domain name space for .nz. And put it horribly simply, you know, when you're trying to find a website or an email address that ends in .nz, we do that magic. We also have a public good side, and we like to kind of weigh in on policy issues and legal issues that affect the internet. Our byline is that we're about an internet for all and an internet for good, you know, because the internet really is awesome, and it's been getting a little bit of a bad rap over the past day. By internet for all, it's about helping New Zealanders harness the power of that internet and making sure that all of us, if we want to, can make the most of this increasingly digital world. And we're also about this thing that we describe as an internet for good. And this is a little bit of an evolution of our thinking on what it means to advocate for a free and an open internet. And I think we're just all conscious, you know, in the wake of the Christchurch terror attacks, that we kind of needed to reflect more openly about the bad things that can happen on the internet, as well as the amazing stuff that it helps us do. So for Internet for Good is about acknowledging that the internet, it can be better for us as individuals, for our communities, and for the whole world in general. And all this misinformation online, that's not an internet for good. And that's why we wanted to be part of the conversation today. So the big question for this session is, if these information disorders are inevitably going to be a thing, how do we protect ourselves? And we think at Internet New Zealand, the high-level answer, or the prescription, is to take a community approach, and that we need to work across the whole community to deal with the spread of these harmful infodemics. And we reckon
the mic closer?
Oh, sorry. It is so heavy, this microphone. And we reckon there are 5 things that need to be considered when we take this community prescription. And I think these 5 things summarize a lot of the things that we've been talking about over the last couple of days. So the first thing is we need to be clear about what we're talking about. And we very helpfully just had a slide that, talks about misinformation, disinformation, malinformation. And these are all very different things. And when you're thinking about how you might want to weigh in and deal with some of that, you need to think about which of those that you're focusing on. Because, issues like election integrity, COVID-19, or whether Paul McCartney died in 1966, they're not equal. The response is going to depend on the problem that we're looking at. And as others have pointed out over the last couple of days, spreading of misinformation isn't that underlying problem, but it certainly contributes to it. And those underlying problems are around, the trust in the accurate or the authoritative sources is waning, and belief in dangerous mistruth or conspiracy theories is costing lives and affecting our democracies. But the deal is, if we can understand those underlying problems, then we start to open up the avenues for the community-centered solutions. So this brings me to point 2 of the 5 points. And this is about evidence. So we actually need to have evidence and information about what's actually going on here in New Zealand. How are New Zealanders experiencing the internet and these misinformation issues? Because if we don't understand what experiences people are having, how do we know where to look, if we want to do something about this? And there are some organisations in the NGO world offering to help government do this. But, getting the funding support is really challenging. And one of the difficulties for NGOs working in this area is knowing who in government to go to, like, who are the people we should go chat to about misinformation? And sometimes these things can fall between the cracks. So that's something we could look to make a little easier for those who want to help out with this. The third part of the community prescription is that we do need some systemic across-the-board responses to the misinformation challenges, in addition to also taking some individual responsibility. And there's a few systems that we could take a look at. The first one is the technical systems, the ones that can track and break the trains of transmission of misinformation. These can remove content. Content doesn't need to be removed forever. And removal of content isn't the only remedy. So yesterday, Twitter talked about, the processes they've got to flag content and reduce its amplification. But while it's really great that platforms are starting to build these systems, many of them, though, aren't providing enough visibility about their design and how they work, or transparency on how they make decisions. And I think a lot of us have been talking about there's room for improvement there, so that can be part of the prescription as well. The second set of systems we can think about to help us solve this, work our way through, are legal systems. There are levers in a lot of areas that governments might want to look at. Laws on competition, laws on privacy, laws on data protection, media laws. Yesterday, we heard there were a lot of concerns about the business models of some of the big platforms. If we were up for dealing with that, maybe we could look at a competition law response. People have been talking about, do we split up these bigger platforms? Do we have a look at privacy and data protection laws? Those would actually change the business models. less monetizing of ourselves, maybe. Let me say I'm not proposing this, but I'm just saying this is an area to consider. And then the sort of after, the legal systems, the tech systems, also, there's supporting individuals with the critical thinking, with the digital skills and inclusion, bringing in more public interest media, all part of the mix. But as others have said, these all have some limited impacts if we're not also looking, at those underlying issues. So the fourth thing then in this prescription is we need to have everybody working together to address misinformation issues, and others have talked about this over the last few days as well. So this includes our community groups, our tech companies, our governments and experts. And there are some really great examples where we can see a lot of engagement going on between the larger tech companies and with governments. But community organisations or community voices, youth voices, as we've just heard, aren't usually part of the conversation, although sometimes they are. But I think we need to see more of that. And what do we mean by community? There's quite a few elements. There is the technical community who care and know about the internet and have got reckons on some of this stuff, so we can invite them into the conversation. There's civil society groups who care about human rights. There are organisations who are in their communities, perhaps representing minority voices. And then there's actually the people in the community as well. So there's scope to tap in at all of those levels. And then we can think about, governments and what can their role be with community. And we think it's one of support. And in particular, what we'd like to propose here for part of the prescription is government funding communities to figure out what the solutions might be that would work for them. And don't go tagging that money for particular things. Actually say, here's some funding for community to think about misinformation issues in their community. And then industry can also do more to reach out to community when developing new systems, new features or industry codes. And speaking of codes, I'm not sure if anyone has clocked the new Australian Misinformation Code, developed by Digi, which is the industry group for the tech sector in Australia.
Kim, sorry, just because we have a hard stop with the people getting a flight. So
sure.
Final point.
Final point.
Yeah.
Okay, but we reckon that's not going to work because that is not a systemic thing. And this community empowerment is just really important because it's the thing that's going to bring trust. But the fifth thing to remember then simply is misinformation is connected to other things. And this is especially the case with regulation. Solutions you have for one thing might break other things. So an Australian new law to get more cash into the pockets of publishers might actually push us more down the track of misinformation as folks are going to get shut out of the social media place where they go and get their news. And the New Zealand government is about to tackle this media review. It's part of its solution for the Christchurch call issues. So it's really important that the government have a think about first principles. How could you use this review to really understand the information systems in New Zealand, where people go for that information, and how best might we regulate that?
Thank you, Kim. Cara, 10 minutes, if you don't mind.
No problem, Sanj, and I'm happy to keep it short so that we can throw to questions and a bit of Q&A amongst the panel, given the time limitations. But quickly, kia ora, my name is Kara Hinesley, Director of Public Policy for Australia and New Zealand at Twitter, as well as the steward for our Data for Good program, which we're very proud to partner with the University of Otago and NCPACS on. I just want to say thank you, Nicole and Kim. I found that very informative, very informational. I appreciated the presentations and the community-led approach. I would agree with many of your points, and I would say that all of us on this panel actually agree on the idea that we need to have shared definitions. We need to have shared terminology. And with that foundation, I think we'll be able to build quite strong collaborative approaches cross-functionally and across government, industry, civil society, and NGOs. In terms of a Twitter perspective, I know that you've heard from our amazing lead, Vijay, and Kathleen yesterday, and so I won't go into too much detail off the top. just to ensure that we can, again, save some time for discussion. But some of the things that I would just flag that's been raised, especially around co-regulatory and self-regulatory approaches, especially in relation to the Australian Disinformation and Misinformation Code, the Voluntary Industry Code that we recently enacted. One of the key things that we're really working towards, again, with this code is to have a consistent threshold and baseline amongst a number of different companies that offer a vast variety of services, everything from news aggregation services and actual publishers to social media companies to cloud service providers. We have a number of companies that have all publicly signed on to this. And I think the idea we're trying to ensure is not only are there thresholds, but also there's a level of transparency with annual reports so that people are able to understand not only where policies are with respective companies, but also how those policies are being enforced and what kind of impacts we're seeing from those enforcement measures. So it's a huge step in the right direction. We always say this work is never done, and we're always trying to meet the evolutions and changing contours of conversation. But that's a code that I think is something that is leading the way in the way that we're looking at misinformation, disinformation together, and also how are we going to tackle some of these larger issues around big current events, you know, civic integrity, election processes, and the like. The other thing I would just quickly note too is experimentation. I think that's something that Twitter is trying to work on out in the open much more. And I think when we talk about industry and tech companies coming to the table, one of the things that we also want to work with trusted partners, but also have the people that use our service help us understand is what is working and what is not. And that's through experimenting with the product, with policies, as we go and as we come up with new, come up against new problems or new changes in the way that people are interacting together in online spaces. I know, for instance, we've been trying out a number of different experiments, whether it's, prompting people when we think that they might be tweeting something that would upset another person, to rolling out the read before you retweet prompt, which is encouraging people to actually click through to articles before they retweet the content. We actually found that when we've been running this experiment for a couple months, and we actually found out that 40% more people were reading the article after seeing the prompt than without the prompt. And so it's these kinds of stats that are helping us again inform what approach should we have? How should we be able to work with people to stem misinformation and disinformation, but also to really allow that space for freedom of expression and conversation in the public realm? Our CEO, Jack, and co-founder has always said that the best parts of Twitter actually come from the people that use it. And so we're trying to really lead with people in mind, the user at the forefront, and then seeing how we make these different changes and if they actually work and achieve their intended objectives. So that's probably the last point I'll just quickly make. And let's hand over to you, Sanj, so that we can chat a little bit more about this important topic.
Yeah, thanks, Cara. Thanks for that perspective. And thank you to all the three speakers for presenting. Listen, this is pretty much for an Aotearoa New Zealand conversation, really. If you take a look at the agenda, it is very much what Aotearoa New Zealand wants to present as the best practices for governance and government and oversight and regulatory and legal mechanisms and frameworks moving forward around information disorders. But it is also for perhaps people in the room to kind of put up red flags around anything that was proposed as a way in which these can be addressed. We have several senior policymakers in the room. I don't know who's on Zoom, but this is pretty much your opportunity to kind of question the presenters. Anybody in the room wants to take a crack? Yeah, Jeremy.
Hi there, thanks very much. I guess this is a question for everyone, but it occurred to me when I was listening to Cara. So you talked about the product and experimenting with the product, and you also talked about interacting with governments and collaborating with governments, do you think that there's any room for the product looking different for different governments, or do you want to roll out the same product across the world?
Thanks for the question. I would say in relation to having a different product for different governments, I would be extremely concerned that if we start to go down that route, that we are going to actually further fracture any sort of shared realities that we have online, and not only lead to a further splinternet or balkanization of the internet into kind of walled gardens, but also start to really have an unequal or uneven sort of experience for everybody on the platform. One of the key things and principles that Twitter has upheld since its inception is the idea of an open public conversation. And our platform is very different from a lot of other social media or tech companies in the fact that by default, we're public and it's all in real time. And so you're able to speak in this conversational sort of way with people around the world, whether you actually know them or not. And it's based on a follow model instead of a friend model, which is a bit different in terms of, you know, again, expanding out your networks and expanding out folks that would be part of the conversation versus your kind of friends and family and people that you already know. So I would be worried that if we, again, go down that route, especially knowing other areas and governments that we're currently dealing with. I think our senior director, Kathleen Reen, mentioned some of the concerns around you most recently seen in Russia, where we're being throttled and being slowed down in terms of the actual platform being able to operate on the internet. You know, this is something we've also seen internet shutdowns in Myanmar as everything is taking place there. And so that would, I think, open the door for a lot of authoritarian governments and areas where we're seeing freedom of speech and dissent being quashed by government. I think that that would just be an open door to actually further kind of enshrine that in the platform and the internet, which would be antithetical to the way that we're trying to look at having a global public conversation and preserve the open internet as a company.
Do you have any response? No. Okay. I just wanted to play. I mean, you can please feel free. It's directed at Cara, but perhaps in the room as well. Cara, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, was very gracious in sending us an opening statement. And of course, what she articulated has been articulated by other speakers in over the 2 days as well. And one of the points was around algorithmic transparency, but also algorithmic harms and, you know, the rabbit holes and whatnot, and this entire set of issues around algorithms. And I don't think that this is an issue that's going to go away. And so there's varying understandings of what an algorithm is. But, you know, just to riff off the point that you made about the product being and not being different to different people, you know, there is an argument to be made that, you know, the products are different things to different people based on their geographic location or the language that they kind of primarily use the product in, and how the algorithm kind of shapes their user experience. And also the degree to which, I suppose, language localization plays a role in user intervention and user feedback reporting as well. So around this whole business, I mean, I think there have been some statements made on Analyst Day by Twitter around giving the user more control about algorithms. But I don't want it to be just about Twitter. What do you see as the future of algorithms in our information order, in our information ecosystem? I suppose is a larger systemic question I wanted to ask. It plays as much a role in Sri Lanka as it does in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So given that there is so much suspicion, doubt, fear, anxiety over this phrase or idea or term or technology, how do you see that playing out 2021 and beyond? And maybe that's a question for the two of you as well. Cara, you can take a crack at that, and then I can, you know, get Kim and Nicole to.
All right, I'll take a quick crack, and then I would be happy to hand over to the amazing women on the panel. In terms of the way that we're looking at algorithms, I would just quickly note from a Twitter perspective that algorithms operate very differently on our platform than they do on other company platforms. We have the option actually of in the little, if you're in the app, if you look in the top right-hand corner, there's a little button, we call it swish. It looks like a sparkle icon, but essentially it turns off the algorithm on the timeline. So people are able to turn that on and off as they wish. And it goes back to a pure reverse chronological timeline, which means the most recent thing that was tweeted is up at the top, and so on. So it's something that we haven't really ingrained into our product quite the same way as we've seen in perhaps other social media platforms or tech company platforms. What I would say though is, as we're looking at this, I think we'd all agree that algorithmic transparency is incredibly important in a place that we need to move towards. One of the ideas that, like on Analyst Day, you mentioned our CEO, Jack Dorsey, has spoken about before and is looking at very strategically, is the idea of almost like an algorithm app marketplace. But basically the idea that people would be able to choose their own algorithms and they would understand what it does, what it's surfacing, how it works, and people would have algorithmic choice in terms of what they're applying. So some of the options would be maybe to, you know, be able to filter out certain spam or certain content that you don't want to see, or to promote up, you know, things that you really do like video games or movies or something, or just conversations from people you follow. Like there's a lot of different options, and they're currently investigating how it all work. But the idea about algorithmic choice is something that we feel very passionately about and will be trying to move towards in the coming months and years.
Did you have any thoughts on that, or anything else, Kim, frankly?
Algorithmic transparency, absolutely, yes, let's have some more of that. And as you say, it's not as simple as some would imagine. But you know, there are some amazing technologists in civil society, I think, who we could definitely would be able to, you know, if a tech firm opened the can on an algorithm, could have a little look at that on behalf of the rest of us. And can we do more to, in a plain English way, explain to the users of the platforms how these algorithms are working? It doesn't just have to be, hello, look at my algorithm. And you know, Kara's comments just now about having a little more algorithmic choice, if you like. I know as a user, I would definitely love to be able to, say what I'm after, what I want to see, to kind of say, this is my profile, this is how to treat me. And if we could head in that direction, that would be a great direction to go in. And also just in New Zealand, a little plug, for the work that Stats has been doing around algorithmic transparency in government. That's a nice
Could you explain that for the people on Zoom, maybe, who might not be familiar with what?
I wonder if someone from government in the audience might want to explain that. I'd hate to kind of speak on behalf of.
Everybody from government is looking very shy at the moment.
Yeah.
Paul, maybe just very quickly, because people on Zoom might not be familiar.
Sure. The New Zealand government, through its Department of Statistics, recently published the first algorithmic charter, or algorithm charter, which sets out a set of principles for the way the government will use algorithms when processing data that belongs to citizens and is in its care. That puts a number of principles underneath that data around accessibility, explainability, ethical use, upholding things like the Privacy Act, etc. And commits to ensuring that those algorithms are regularly reviewed as well. It's a bit of a first, signed up to by about 60 or 70% of government departments at the moment, and more coming on board as they understand more about what it means. Hopefully that's about right, Kim.
I would agree with my co-panelist and what Paul said. And I think it's important to realize that our understanding, and certainly what the public who know about algorithms, what their view of it is, very much based on behavioral advertising. So it's a for-profit geared algorithm. So if you can program an algorithm to do that, you can program an algorithm to do other things like deliver services, holistic nudges, all those kind of things. So I think the potential for the future is very much balancing out those human rights issues, those privacy issues, those civil libertarian issues, with how you want to be treated online. My only hesitation around sort of building your own algorithm, or this is the information I want to see, that kind of thing, I can easily sort of see how when we talk about radicalization, for example, you just go further and further and further down that rabbit hole without any kind of checks and balances or interjection of fresh information, which could become really, really scary.
Yeah. It's the classic definition of a wicked problem we have.